Ladies and gentlemen, please silence your phones and hush your babies. The show is about to start. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a live stream. The recent reporting and subsequent podcasts done by Murray Jones of the New Zealand Herald has shown us that the church's system for handling abuse could do with some work. The helpline system may help the church by putting people who want to report abuse or bishops who have been made aware of abuse straight in the path of church lawyers. But the thing to remember is those lawyers work for the church. They don't work for the victim, and they certainly don't work for the bishop on the other end of the phone. And the Bisbee, Arizona case highlights this in a way that I wish it didn't. A child was abused for 7 years because the advice of the helpline was that the abuse shouldn't be reported to authorities. So what would be the solution to this? What could we do? The solution would be a scenario whereby bishops, outside of what the church may recommend to them or not, would have to report the abuse because it would be mandatory. So to join me for a discussion tonight about mandatory reporting, I have got Sarah, who is from 21st Century Saints and an expert on the safeguarding of children. We've got Ruth, who is a ruthless heathen, as it says on the tagline of her video. And so she's here to provide that perspective. And then here is Peter Bleakley from Mormon Civil War. Peter needs no introduction, really, does he? I would say.
Sometimes I need reminding who I am. It's been a long day.
You're Peter, and you're here to talk about safeguarding of children.
How did this happen? I was Peter Priesthood a few years ago. Something's gone wrong.
Well, no, you're Anthony Apostate now.
Yeah. Sorry, can we just do a priesthood check? Anyone got the priesthood here?
No.
Yeah.
No priesthood here. But what there is good times, good vibes, and good conversation, because we're going to talk, well, about quite a heavy subject, admittedly. The reason this has come up is because the UK is exploring just that idea that I spoke about a moment ago of mandatory reporting of abuse or suspicions of abuse or anything such. We'll get into the details of it. But first, let's just welcome to the stage the thumbnail for today's show, which is Corporate Jesus outside the Bishop's office. There you are. Enjoy that. I'm just proud of my artwork. So all this started really, I'm just going to run you through a quick timeline, everyone that's watching. This started with the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, which started in 2015 and didn't conclude until 2022. These government inquiries take a long time, several years, and they will bring in people from all sorts of areas to ask questions and get witness statements, etc. And they did a section, and this started, by the way, because of the Jimmy Savile incidents of people in positions of power with access to children abusing children. So the government thought, is there a way that we could stop that happening? And they did a particular focus in one area on religious settings. So this was all walks of life that this covered, but they did a particular set of inquiries on religious settings. And so, of course, the church spoke to that inquiry, and church lawyer Andrew Ford spoke to the inquiry at the request of the church in response to the inquiry's request for someone to come forward and speak. And he said to the inquiry, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has 157,457 members in England and Wales. There were 16 recorded allegations of child sexual abuse within the church in the previous 10 years. 16 recorded allegations of child sexual abuse within the church in the previous 10 years. That would mean that 0.01016% of the population of the church was involved in an allegation of abuse, was the victim of alleged abuse. Compare that to the general population of England and Wales. It's estimated that 500,000 children are sexually abused each year. So not even allegations, just ones that, that it's happening to. And that makes up 0.73153% of that population, which means that apparently the church is 70 times safer than the rest of your life in the UK or in England or Wales, certainly. Does that ring true to you, panel?
No, not at all. So the children that are attending on a Sunday at church are also the ones that are out there in the real world. In the UK, and so those stats just don't make sense. And let's not even get into, you're more likely to be abused by a family member than you are by stranger danger or your Jimmy Saviles or any of those sorts of things. So,
and they don't stop being your family when you walk through the doors of the church building.
No.
And also let's take into account that 11% of all sexual abuse that takes place in a faith community setting.
Yeah,
that's a huge number.
I would imagine between us and anecdotally in the chat as well, which thanks everyone for getting stuck in the chat, we could count more than 16 allegations of abuse within the LDS Church in a 10-year period. Certainly. So that seems like a lowball number, is what I would say. And so when this inquiry concluded, it came out with pages of recommendations, as you would expect from a 7-year process. Among them was the recommendation that there be mandatory reporting of abuse. So that's the one we're going to focus on tonight. And that's the one that's made its way into a proposed law. So there's a bill going through Parliament at the moment. This one started in the House of Lords. A quick explainer for those who are from the States and don't understand the UK system. There's 2 houses in our government. There's the House of Commons, the House of Lords. And the House of Lords is the higher house. So normally a piece of legislation comes forward in the House of Commons. It's debated, discussed, it's sent up to the House of Lords. They will recommend changes. It will be sent back down to the Commons. They will then debate those changes, and back and forth, back and forth, back and forth it can go until eventually it's signed into law. That's essentially how that works in a nutshell. What's interesting is this one started as a private member's bill in the House of Lords. I think perhaps because it came off the back of a government inquiry, and often it's the House of Lords that are involved in that because there's often judges in the House of Lords. So, that could be why that happens. But this is what's come forward, the Regulated and Other Activities, Mandatory Reporting of Child Sexual Abuse Bill. So regulated and other activities, that has a specific definition. Sarah, can you just explain that for the audience, please?
Regulated activities are any activities that are delivered by employees or volunteers working with children under the age of 18 on 3 or more occasions in a 30-day period. So all of primary, all of youth, seminary, Sunday school, they're all falling into that category.
Okay. And that category obviously has effect outside of the church. So,
Absolutely.
If you're in Boy Scouts or, you work at a school, you're engaged in regulated activities with children. Any
clubs or hobbies, essentially, that children might be participating in would now fall under these sorts of criteria.
Or even one single overnight activity between the hours of 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. with children becomes a regulated activity, even if it's only once as well.
And so that's important to remember. Just as the inquiry wasn't just aimed at churches, neither is this bill. This bill will have a wide scope out into British life, and it will change fundamentally the way that children are protected and looked after. This is a monumental bill if it passes, and the scope of it could be quite forceful. So it's not that they've just looked at churches and gone, there's a problem here. They've seen that there's a problem in broader British society. Jimmy Savile was a beloved children's TV host. He was someone that most people would trust with their children because that's the version of himself he put out in the world. I remember when I was studying English for my A-levels, I did an assignment on the change of language discussing Jimmy Savile in the newspapers from when he died, and everyone was sad that he died and his national treasure died. Then when the allegations started to come out, and then once it started to be proven what he'd done, you can just see the decline in his reputation. He was an absolute national treasure falling from grace. So yeah, this happened everywhere.
I think it's also important to point out, Nima, that one of the things the inquiry recommended as well was that there should not be any exceptions to mandatory reporting based on religious or confidentiality or anything like that. That shouldn't lead to an exception. So
none are exempt.
Absolutely.
Is the idea. Okay, right. So this is the NSPCC put together a little summary. On the 6th of January 2025, the Home Secretary provided an update on the Labour government's plans to make it mandatory to report child sexual abuse. The NSPCC, Ooh,
National Society for
Society
Prevention of Cruelty to Children.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, it's just you think about the initials and you realize society is in a for the isn't, but yeah. So there you go, NSPCC. The government will put forward measures in the crime and policing bill to make it an offence to fail to report or to cover up child sexual abuse with professional and criminal sanctions. They'll make it a criminal offence, and there are differences in the UK between civil offences and criminal offences. Trespass, for example, in the UK is a civil offence. So if you do it and then the police say, okay, you're trespassing, can you leave, please? And you leave, nothing will happen to you. Whereas here, it's a criminal offence, which means if you're caught doing it, then there are consequences. Again, for the American audience, that's in a nutshell the way that difference goes. So the bill is bound to be put before Parliament this spring, and it is already making its way through Parliament. So that's the boring stuff out of the way. Now we're going to get into the meat of the discussion of tonight. And I want to start by throwing out this question. Will mandatory reporting help? And feel free to push back on the question. Ask for clarifiers. Peter, I'm going to throw you up first.
Okay. I'm in favour, and I think Sarah's got some sort of thoughts on why it is controversial and people are in two minds about. So, for example, Bill Rill, who's a sort of leading LDS podcaster, or post-Mormon rather, has kind of stated that he's coming down towards against it, where this has been talked about before. So even within post-Mormon communities, there are people worried that it could deter disclosures. I think the place that comes from, and Bill used to be a bishop, so he's kind of been in that position, is sometimes there's kind of an over expectation of the power and influence that a bishop has and how essential they are in everyone's lives. There are loads of ways for young people to disclose abuse. It doesn't have to come through the church or to a bishop. And they sometimes get an overinflated sense of their own importance or omnipresence in people's lives. So I think some of the ways that it will help a lot is simply by forcing the LDS Church in particular, because a lot of churches are already all over this. They already have policies to report. So we are very much dragging behind, despite some recent progress. I think what will help is it will force a much higher level of constant vigilance and consciousness about abuse and being aware of it and how to respond. It will force the church to do really proper professional level safeguarding training if they cooperate.
We're not getting into how it'll affect the church yet, though, Peter. Save that stuff for later.
Well, okay. Here's the simple reason to support it and work through whatever difficulties will come. There are hundreds, thousands, millions of children in this world growing into adults who were abused as children, and other adults knew and did nothing about it. And I think that's an incredible burden to carry when it's bad enough that you, in a sense, have to process your feelings about your abuser. But when you get the message that you can't trust wider society, you can't trust other adults, but in your own family or in your school or in whatever situation, to actually just, for goodness sake, get you away from an abuser, that's something you have to live with for the rest of your life. That's an existential sort of shock to, I'm not minimizing the experience of abuse itself, but and people can continually report this. So I was reading someone's account in a discussion around similar things in social media this week. And this young person said, I just can't let go of the fact that people, and this is a Mormon context, at church knew that I was being harmed and they didn't stop it. And I was a child. I mean, it's unconscionable. That just has to always be the overriding morality here, is we cannot allow harm to happen to people and vulnerable adults without feeling a responsibility to stop it.
So can I jump in on that point there then, Peter? Because I think what's interesting about this legislation is that it would make it a criminal offence not to report abuse. So they would have to essentially prove that you knew about it and didn't report it. And the thing I find interesting about that is you would think that it is the moral thing to do if you suspect abuse to report it. that's what people should be doing anyway. So this doesn't seem like an invasion of anyone's rights. What would you be doing there? Protecting the right of someone to not report abuse? Why would you ever want to protect that right? Exactly. Why would you want that?
Well, there's only one reason for anybody to actually want to write to not report abuse. There's only two reasons. One is they're protecting somebody, and the other is they're covering something up. Those are the only reasons for anybody to want the right to not report.
Yeah, because I would want to know that, because in order for some people to do the right thing, there has to be a negative consequence, right? Again, that's where I was getting at with that. You would assume it would be the automatic thing, but as we learn with supermarket trolleys, some people will put them back and some people won't. There's no penalty for not putting your supermarket trolley back at the car park and just leaving it out there. So some people just won't do it. And some people in society need the stick to encourage them to do the right thing.
They do. And what I would suggest is sorry, Sarah, it's not just about providing the stick, it's providing a levelling up of expectation across the whole of the UK, and on the back of that, it's providing a framework of support and guidance and clarification about signs and the signals that we might be looking for, particularly in vulnerable children who aren't yet able to have a voice of their own, children who have had abuse so normalized in their families that they don't even realize they're giving a disclosure of something that's happening to them. And so when it's down to mandatory reporting and people feel enabled to interpret those signs and know what to do with that information, we are not leading a vigilante mob. We are relaying that promptly to the right people that can do the right things with that information, who can correlate various bits of information, maybe from school, maybe from church, maybe from clubs, maybe from family members, maybe from neighbours who've got cause for concern. And they're putting that information together then and coming up with a package of support for a vulnerable family. And I think it then takes the weight off of the reporter's shoulders, knowing that everybody not only has that responsibility, but has the tools and the language to be able to do something with it.
Well, just a couple of things before Sarah jumps in. I think where I was going with that, and I agree with you there, Ruth, is in an ideal world, that's what you create. You create a society where people know what to look out for and they know how to protect everyone's children. But there will be that group of people where in the back of their mind, they're like, oh, should I do something? Should I not? And if they're aware that if they don't, they could be in trouble, they're more likely to err on the side of saying something. And that's the side of things we want people to err on. So you look at the Arizona case, those bishops were told they would get in trouble or could get in trouble if they reported that abuse for breaking clergy penitent privilege. And this is flipping that on its head and saying, no, the way you would get in trouble is if you didn't do something to help, if you didn't do the right thing. We talked about before we went live here, there's a bit of a reluctance in the UK to call emergency services sometimes. And what we need to understand about this and about calling the emergency services is what you're doing. If you're making a disclosure to, the NSPCC or the police or whoever you're talking to, they are trained and knowledgeable enough to know how serious it actually sounds versus what you're telling them. They know how to escalate it, what to do. Similarly, you call the emergency service in the UK, something's happened and you're not sure, you call them. They are the ones that then make the judgment call about whether they should get involved or not. So you're not calling the police, you're calling an operator who will send the police if the police are necessary. Similarly,
you might be the fifth person that's rang about a road accident, or the fifth person that's rang about a fire, and is it out of control? Do I, and they say it's fine, we're already aware, we're on the way. Or it's fine, it's under control, it's on a sports field, it's an organised event, it's been planned, it's okay. So passing that information on to, and I think dialing 999 is a really good example, again, takes the weight off the reporter's shoulders and places the responsibility then with the people who can actually do something with that information.
Yeah, I think that's critically important. Passing all the information on. It's not for us to make a decision about whether we think it's abuse or not. It's not for us to decide whether it should be investigated or not. It's for us to give the information to the relevant authorities that they can then use their expertise to investigate as they see fit. I think we do find that there's an absolute fear, certainly in our society, of people making an allegation against somebody that they feel could have a drastic impact on somebody's life, and then it might turn out to be false. Yeah. And part of what this bill is saying very clearly is that people need to be reporting concerns and signs and indicators of abuse, as well as any witnessing of abuse and as well as any disclosure of abuse. So where people are going to be fearful is, if I report this as a sign and indicator and concern and I'm wrong, am I affecting somebody's life? And importantly, they've included in the bill a clause that says that there will be no action taken against anybody that makes a report in good faith. If it turns out to not be substantiated as abuse, there will be no action taken. So that should encourage people to feel a little bit safer to make reports of abuse where they're necessary.
Mm-hmm. And the thing is, they will, they'll have a record of what you say to them. So if you say, yes, so-and-so is definitely being abused, it's definitely happening, and it turns out to be absolutely false, they're going to come back on you and go, why were you saying these sorts of things? But similarly, the family or individuals, okay, we've had a report that someone's concerned about your child. They're going to send qualified individuals to have a look around that home. Are there signs of abuse? Does this child look well cared for? People that abuse their children, unfortunately, some are very good at hiding it. Some aren't. As I'm sure you could tell us, Sarah, some people are fairly open about it. And so all it takes is for a person with a trained eye to look and they can spot it. Or they can spot if it looks like someone is actually being well looked after and someone's worrying maybe unnecessarily. No system's perfect. Peter, after Sarah.
Yeah, it isn't perfect. Will mandatory reporting help? Absolutely. It's going to help immeasurably. And 88% of victims that spoke to the independent inquiry, and there are over 10,000 that spoke to them, said they wanted mandatory reporting. It will absolutely help. It will remove discretion from people that don't have the ability, the skills, or the knowledge to understand what it is they're making discretionary decisions about. So it absolutely will help. But I think we also need to be aware that it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to be a cure-all for abuse. First of all, the very, very best thing that we can ever do is to prevent abuse. So that's actually in another box, but that's the most important thing. But it's not going to be a cure-all for abuse. What we do know is that victims take on average 26 years to tell about abuse. So therefore, that in itself would tell us that mandatory reporting has a long, long way to go to be the most effective tool. But it's one tool in our toolbox that is incredibly powerful. It absolutely needs to bring about an end to client clergy privilege that the church are holding on to, with some rather strange claims about how it can enable perpetrators to come forward. Well, if they've only had 16 allegations in 10 years, I don't see why they need to hold on to that client clergy privilege. And the other part of that is, if they are holding on to that, how are they actually identifying and assessing the risk that perpetrator poses? How are they putting an effective risk management plan in place? How are they meeting the needs of the victim, more importantly than anything else, if they're not involving external authorities? So it will absolutely help in that decision should be taken away from them. And I think I'm right in saying that client clergy privilege in the church is a policy. It's not a doctrine, it's a policy. Therefore, they can turn it on its head in order to comply with mandatory reporting laws.
I want to point to a comment here by Beyond Belief, who said, so many children would have been protected if they said something when they saw something. If everyone knew bits about Savile said something, then the big pitch would have come out. Yeah, it's often about getting these little bits together. We're going to move on to the next question while Peter lets us know his thoughts.
I think sort of a counter argument here. We're all talking about, when you phone these people, you'll get this excellent professional response and all that. I do think we also, though, need to reality check that this is going to cost a huge amount of extra money to actually provide these resources. At the moment, the reality in our country and many Western countries, or any countries in the world, is that social services are massively overstretched, that there are huge delays in queues. You can be in a waiting queue for 4 years even to get a special educational needs diagnosis. We do not have the staff, we do not have the funding. The government is screwing up our economy, so they're talking about every sector of government making massive cuts at the moment. So I'm sure it'll come up in the debates in Parliament, the actual cost of acting on this. But that's, so I think this is where it can become messy for some people, because we know that the outcomes for children in foster care are often much, much worse than the average person. And, you start to worry that on balance, is it better to put up with some abuse and some have a better outcome than being fed into that system that destroys people? And all of those concerns and caveats need to be addressed.
But
They
not
need
by
to
us,
either-
because this is not a political
Right.
podcast.
Well, no, but as in
Absolutely.
the social, the cost and the professional requirement to have the backup system. So, for example, if we look at the debate around abortion in America,
Should we not do that
But
one?
we're not.
you have a strong situation of lots of people from a conservative or religious point of view wanting to massively reduce the number of abortions, but they also oppose the social funding, the contraception and sex education in schools,
And Peter
and
just
the
got
social
cancelled in
support
Texas.
that would
You
that
know,
would be needed
So-
for. Can I finish my statement? Would that be okay? Can I
No,
just
because
finish?
we're cutting you off for a reason, Peter, because we don't want to go down this avenue at this
my point-
point.
Well, the punchline simply is, it even in a purely virtuous cause, you have to also have a lot of social, legal, and social services infrastructure to actually make it work and not end up making things worse. So I'm just acknowledging that this is not an easy win. This is something that governments have to spend a lot of money on, and they have difficult choices to make about priorities. So just making this legislation happen is not the whole picture. It does involve culture change, as we're discussing, but it's going to be difficult to pay for as well.
Yeah.
The two biggest issues of mandatory reporting is very much services being overwhelmed and not able to see the wood for the trees. That is one huge issue. The other issue is the fear that children will be silenced far too early on, and that children might start to hint at something to see if they can trust an adult with information. The adult goes and reports immediately. The child says no more because they're scared of what's happening, and there isn't enough information for an investigation. So there is also a fear that if information is passed on too quickly, it might stop children telling and talking at all. And that needs to be really well thought out in training, education and awareness programs. And that's how they actually make mandatory reporting working. They make it work by linking it to huge public awareness training, really significant, high quality, professionally run training programs in every community, faith communities, schools, sports, across the board. And they actually make sure people understand what they're looking at and how to act. And that's how they make it work.
Yeah.
Well,
And I think as well that we are, we are coming to this off the back of some of the most horrendous scandals that have happened in the UK, and the political will is behind this at this stage, quarter of the way through the century, because of the harm done. We are the generation that well, I am in my 50s, the generation that grew up with Jimmy Savile on the TV, and that generation of the way that we treated children, the way that sexual deviants were protected by society, and the way that a blind eye was turned to things. And I think as adults now, we not only have a responsibility to the children, but we have a responsibility to our peers to say, no, now that we're in a position of power to do something with our votes, with our taxes, with our, put our wallet where our mouth is, we can actually do that as a society. We're in that fortunate position to be able to make a change. And I think the will is there, and we'll figure out the cost of it down the road, because the cost to a society of not dealing with this is catastrophic. It really, really is. And I think there is, you're right, Peter, there is always a financial price to pay, but crikey, if we don't think the next generation of children is worth it, then we have bigger problems as a society.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And now
Church
cutting
can
off
afford it.
cutting
The
off
church
there
can afford it.
before we get,
Pots of money.
because I rule this podcast with an iron fist, and I will cut off anyone who tries to make this too political, including you, Ruth. You're not exempt. We will ask how this will affect the church and get back to our area of expertise, and the things we actually know about, which is how will this affect the church? And Peter, you were making some good points on that earlier, so I'd invite you to start off this bit of discussion. How do you think mandatory reporting, if it comes in, will affect the church?
Well, it will require an entire culture change.
Mhm.
They will, and the church has shown in countries where this sort of thing is required legally, they'll just cooperate with it after kicking up all the fights that they do, a bit like the temple steeple, where they insist in Texas that it has to be mahusive, but they cope with a little tiny tiddler
Yeah.
one in Belgium without any fuss because that's the law. So I think people who are in areas where this hasn't been the normal should perhaps be encouraged by the fact that we already have precedent. There are countries and states that require these kinds of rules, so we can learn from them. And it's not like we're stepping into the complete unknown. And the church itself functions in, I don't know how I mean, we're aware in Australia that there's definitely a whole regime of background checks that the church has to cooperate with very carefully. I don't know specifically if they also have mandatory reporting,
Any
but there are
Australians in the
places,
chat, let us know.
yeah, and any other countries that do this. So, but there is expertise and experience out there, so that shouldn't be too daunting. But at the moment, it's very much, oh, we've got background checks, that's enough. We still are miles away from even basically professional safeguarding training and procedures. The silly movie that they ask people to watch doesn't even begin to deal with most of the issues that need to be trained about and arise. And they all have the caveat of, well, we have this don't be alone with the child rule, but if you're a home teaching companion, that's fine. You can take a young person out in your car regularly every week, have hours alone with them, and go visit people in homes.
Not without a DBS. Not without a DBS, they can't.
Now in Britain, but I'm talking about the global, the training that all Latter-day Saints everywhere do, but sorry, even with the DBS, that's not the too deep protection. So my point remains here.
No, it's true. That's true. Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you got that opportunity for grooming is wide open, despite giving the impression in everything else that you can never be, because the only message of the film ultimately is you can't be alone with the child. You can't be alone with the child. You can't be alone with the child for 5 minutes. You shouldn't get into a car with the child to go on a little trip to get things for a camp. Oh, by the way, but it's fine to do all that if you're a ministering companionship. It's unbelievable. So that has to go. There will need to be so can you clarify, Sarah, is this legislation just about disclosures of abuse, or is it you see signs of abuse without disclosure, therefore you have to mandatorily report that as well? Do you know if that's being part of this legislation?
It only relates to sexual abuse, so it's still not addressing all forms of abuse. It's only sexual, but it becomes, if you have any concerns or signs and indicators of abuse, if you witness abuse or you have a disclosure of abuse, whether the disclosure is made by the victim or the perpetrator, has to be mandatory reported under this bill.
So it's disclosure, but also suspecting that you see signs of abuse and you're concerned. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that will require all kinds of training, regularly updated if they want to do it properly, about what are the legitimate signs of abuse. Then we still got a bureaucracy infrastructure to call. We've got you are one of the state safeguarding specialists, but we need a whole, in my school, you have specially trained team members in the school who and an online system that you report concerns to. But there's also safety nets that if you feel that they haven't dealt with the situation effectively enough, you are asked to go higher up. And you are given a protocol. So I would first go to the head if I feel that the safeguarding officers haven't responded appropriately or enough to my concern. And if I'm not happy with their performance, I will go to one of the governors, who's the safeguarding designated specialist. And if that's not good, I can go to the local county authorities. So all of that needs explaining. There needs to be, one of the major things missing from the training video is, what do you actually do if there is a disclosure? And there are all kinds of super important things to bear in mind, like not asking leading questions, not continuing the conversation, but involving professionals to kind of get to the bottom of things, writing down as soon as possible after the conversation everything that was said as best you can recall it, because it might be months before there's a court case. These are all the basic things that are part of safeguarding training, and none of that is anywhere in the church's training. None of it. So there's they need a whole system. And I think the other major culture change.
Hang on, before you go to the other culture change, Peter, Sarah wanted to come back on that about the training.
Sure.
But we won't put a pin in that.
I want to say, I think there is a huge amount of what's happening in local settings, because I've done that training in our stake, but it's only in our stake. It hasn't been done, to my knowledge, nationally. But I have done 2 training sessions with all the ward councils and leaders and stake leaders in our stake, and we have absolutely looked in depth at all of that, as well as in-depth scenarios. And I think we might need to do that training online at some point to get it out there to wider people. The problem is that's happened because we have got a stake leadership that are willing to say, can you come and do this? We know you can do it. Can you come and do this for us as a stake? And I don't think it's been replicated elsewhere.
But that training then, Sarah, you are reliant on those ward leaders to replicate your years of experience and your knowledge and your resources and pass that on to primary teachers, nursery leaders. And that's
insufficient. It's inadequate.
It is. And I think when we step back and think, yes, they're at church on a Sunday, but in every other sphere of their life, they're out in UK society, they're part of schools, clubs, hobbies, whatever. I don't think we need to, how it will affect the church. It's going to affect the church members anyway, because it will affect them in all these other spheres of life, and it will affect them in their jobs if they work with children, or their hobbies if they coach at the football team, the local football team, whatever it is, it's going to affect them anyway. So I think the church leaning into this, as you say, Peter, with its resources, its financial resources, it would be hugely beneficial to wider community, because for once the church members could actually feel empowered and knowledgeable about something. If the church, instead of dragging its heels, lent in, it would be amazing if they use their resources in that way.
Do you know, one of the recommendations that the independent inquiry made was that there needs to be widespread public communication awareness training around sexual abuse of children. Can you imagine if the church was willing to fund that in every community where they've got a stake or a ward? If they were willing to call in experts and say, we've asked the Centre of Expertise for Sexual Abuse, NSPCC, etc., NWG charity to come in and deliver high quality professional training. We will pay for it. We will use our buildings to deliver it, but we will do that for the community so that we can actually make sure that not only the children attending our church, but all the children in our community are safe. That would be a massive win-win for the church, wouldn't it?
You would think to yourself, I can't understand why the church wouldn't want to be seen as, taking a strong position against the abuse of children, and why they wouldn't want to draw attention to themselves as then you think about it, it would be drawing attention to themselves, and maybe they don't want to, because maybe they don't want people sniffing around the church in this context, because maybe they're worried.
Well, what we do know is that one of the things the inquiry said was that too many churches put their reputation above the need of protecting victims, and they were too focused on making decisions that protected their reputation than they were in making decisions that protected children. Now, does that sound familiar to any of us?
And sadly so. Yeah. Absolutely, and really sadly so. And I'm just looking in the comments. Karen is, she said, in the Methodist Church, we've got a rigorous safeguarding scheme and training, and she's shocked that we don't have that in the LDS Church. We're shocked too, because we live in the UK, and we're really shocked too, Karen, that isn't part of our culture. And if we could lead from the UK, we would do, but sadly, that's we go at the pace of the slowest to take on board these things, and it seems to be that there are parts of the States particularly that really don't want to put this.
We can show that.
Back to the question.
One sec, Sarah. We can show this about the attitudes of Americans by an American who has decided rather foolishly to enter the chat and bait me with the phrase, "As an American." Well, you know that's going to get me teasing you straight away. They say, I have strong feelings about the UK duty to act laws. They're one of the key pillars of we're not doing that our country was built on. And then I look at his subsequent comments. Where's the line of suspected? How do you handle hypochondriacs or see problems everywhere? Well, okay, you can make the same argument about people being able to refer themselves for healthcare. Okay, well, people can't refer themselves to healthcare because they're hypochondriacs and they're constantly wasting GPs' time. Yeah, there are people out there that waste GPs' time. It happens.
Do you know what? That's the role of training, isn't it? That's the role of high quality, good training, and the role of good policies, procedures, and
this
training.
whataboutism of like, oh well, what about malicious false reports? What about the people who are oblivious and miss signs? All right, okay, well, should we just do nothing then?
Yeah.
Right.
There's this idea that, well, if we compel people to try and act properly and then people don't, it was wrong to try and compel people to act properly. That doesn't make any sense. Yes, it may trample on your perceived freedoms, but that's fine. If in America you want to be so free that people can't be asked to behave properly or even compelled to behave properly through legal means in the name of protecting children, I think we have a disagreement there. But I don't think badly of you, Hedgehog in Space. If you've been watching this channel... If you've been watching this channel long enough, you know that I like to rip on Americans at the best of times. So you walked in a bad time there, bud. Peter, can I just say, Peter,
just going back to this, how will it affect the church? I think one of the things we need to be really clear about is what mandatory reporting is trying to do is to make sure that in the eyes of society, children are at least as important as money. We've got strong money laundering laws in this country, which Ruth will be able to speak to far more so than me, where you need to be able to report if you think money has been fraudulently obtained, if it's being used to launder for drugs or anything like that at all. You are legally required to report that as working in finance in any setting. The simple reality is we have none of that to protect children. So we place the managing of money far more highly in society than we do children.
But even in the church, right? Because
and in the church,
there has to be two people with the money when it's being counted up. There have to be two people to take it to the bank. It's always been too deep when it comes to the church's money, but not too deep when it comes to protecting children.
Well, that's right. That's right. So this just redresses some of the balance whereby children become at least as important as money, doesn't it? And thinking about how is this going to affect the church? It's going to affect the church around. They're going to have to do a review of the helpline and how the helpline operates, because mandatory reporting does not give room to have a conversation with a church lawyer before you report to external authorities. It's a case of report to external authorities and then talk to the church lawyer. But that's going to have to be the first step. So that's going to need to be considered. The quality training and the level and amount of training that is being given to people is going to have to be massively considered. Some of the messages that we give to our children and youth about the innate authority of religious leaders and the moral authority that religious leaders have is going to have to be thought about quite carefully, because that's giving some messages that are not conducive to encouraging children to disclose and talk about abuse. So there's quite a few things that need to be actually addressed by the church if they actually want to get ready to look at this. We need to kind of think about how do the church start to go about preparing for mandatory reporting. They've got a lot of training and dissemination to tell every single person in this church working with children that there's criminal sanctions if they don't report concerns of abuse. They've got to know what those concerns are.
I'm going to cut you off there, Sarah, for a second.
You do that.
And bring Peter in to make his second point as penitence for cutting him off last time. I am both harsh, cruel, and fair at the same time. Yeah,
I really appreciate Hedgehog in Space's points, though, because it is and the answer is training, of course. But yes, where do you draw the line? Do you start being suspicious of all of everything? These things could really get out of hand, and you can understand why people have been resistant to implementing these things in their organizations, because you can imagine lots of scenarios where people aren't perfect, where you do have bad players, where you do have people who just like to stir up trouble and drama and live for that. How do you contain that in a situation where you're giving them such a powerful weapon? So I absolutely acknowledge that is a huge concern. And as Sarah said, it's just something we have to do. But it shouldn't be a no, because we already handle money better than this, as you've said. I think that's a brilliant point. I think the another recommendation from ICSA that's relevant to the churches particularly is it recommends that we bring in professional expertise from other organizations. So that's the next major culture shift I think the church will have to face. Is it's been always incredibly resistant to any kind of accountability from outside, whether it's finances or anything else it does. It's extremely protective of that, and its prideful arrogance, thinking it can do it all in house and do it better than everyone else. And their statements about abuse used to claim that we have the gold standard of approaches to safeguarding, which is completely ludicrous. And so I think that's the next thing, that the idea of trusting a secular authority to have that kind of access and scrutiny, and they're going to have to massively shift gear to being cooperative with that, being positive and welcoming it, and stop thinking they know better. And I think that's going to be a major, I think, just kind of as a culture shift that could actually have implications in lots of other areas.
Can I jump in there, Peter? On
I
that
love
point,
that, Peter.
sorry.
Love that.
Because that is a really good point. And I think now that I know there's an American in the chat that I can definitely talk to,
nice to him. He's lovely.
Direct everything at. He is making good points. And I would actually like to hear what he has to say on this point I'm about to make, because I'm about to make a sort of uneducated observation about my view of Americans, is that particularly in Utah, the church and the institutions are so intermingled that I think the hierarchy the church sees of itself and then seeks to project abroad wherever it exists outside of Utah is that there's God, there's the church, and then there's the political institutions and the government agencies and the charities and all that sort of stuff. They are above them in the hierarchy. And in Utah, they almost are. In Utah, they have that level of control. But then outside, all of a sudden, they are forced to confront oversight. And the problem is, I think, the United States Constitution, with its First Amendment, puts them, first or second, I believe first, puts them almost as a law unto themselves. You declare yourself a church, and then there is no oversight. You don't have to file a tax return of any kind. You can, and the church does file certain returns and things like that, but you can see that they feel perfectly entitled to write 1 million or over 1 million to indicate that they don't feel like they should have to put it out there at all. And they don't get in trouble for that. It gets reported in the news, but there's no trouble. They got fined 5 million by the SEC. That is huge, massive. But they had to do some really bad stuff. So I think that's the culture the church has exported to the other parts of the world in which it lives. And that's why Brits, who are normally used to having government oversight or people more involved in their business in every other facet of their life, feel this tension when it comes to church, because the church is like, no, well, of course, we're not going to let the NSPCC come in and do training on how we can better spot signs of abuse. We can do that because we are up here and they're below. Does that make sense? Am I just rambling? People in the chat, let me know what you think about that.
No, that's good point. It's a good point, Nemo.
And I think what you're saying there is both poking the bear, but also it's hugely sympathetic to the weird mindset that sometimes gets permeated across the world then from Utah, because that is the reality, that is the lived reality there, and has been for nearly 200 years, I guess. So to be told by other parts of the world that isn't going to fly, and you are going to have to either step up your game or be asked to not function as a church in this country. That must be mind-blowing to them, and I feel sympathy for them. But that's the reality. Most of the world is secular, and most of the world, while being tolerant and inclusive of all religions and faiths, is going to expect the same standards for the whole of society, regardless of whether you're a faith group or you're a football group. It really doesn't matter to society. They want the best for the people in that society.
Yeah.
So, Peter, if you want to round off your point, if you remember where you were.
No, I do.
And then we'll get to 21st. Of course you do. Then we'll get to 21st
absolutely.
Century Saints and what they've been up to.
Brilliant. So this idea of sort of allowing in expertise from the outside, just as a sort of side issue, we'd have to break down these walls of paranoia Now, the high demand fundamentalist religions that aren't always honest with their members about a lot of things rely entirely in creating that bubble that nothing external penetrates. And they relentlessly indoctrinate the members with this idea that you can't trust anything out there in the world, and they're always out to destroy us because they're ruled by Satan. And even grown adults with professional lives believe that, and it's it's ludicrous when you think about it, but or step away from it and get away from the mantra. Sometimes you can't see how ludicrous that is when you're in it. So that could have really interesting knock-on effects. But I think to frame that positively, the church is all about collaborating with like-minded organizations. It says that's part of its thing. So if you embrace people who are experts in child safeguarding, and you stop seeing it as a personal attack, that's a way we can absolutely frame this in a very positive way. And the church has stated, so in response to myself and others appearing on the BBC a few years ago to talk about this on the Victoria Derbyshire show, the Europe Area Presidency issued a statement in which they said the church is always seeking to improve, to get better at safeguarding. So this is absolutely a way to do it. Talk to professionals and learn from them. So I don't think this has to be, there are ways for them to work with their usual tropes to make this a positive and to happen. But it is going to be I think anytime the church has scrutiny from external organizations, like happened in the Mormon moment in mid-1990s, and with the Salt Lake Olympics and all the rest of it, that a whole amount of adjustment of those boundary policing and changes and reforms and the Gospel Topics essays and anti-racist statements came out of that, being forced by circumstances to engage with the world a bit more closely. So I can only see that as being healthy, especially for this issue. But I think it could have interesting knock-on effects in other areas where the church is self-destructing by not waking up and being realistic about how it looks to rational, normal, secular people. So I think that's going to be really exciting to see how that plays out.
I'm going to throw up Hedgehog in Space has got another comment. They've become my go-to person tonight. So I really like your little thumbnail as well. It's a really cool little hedgehog.
That is cool.
Rocket ship with a little bubble around its head. Great thumbnail there. So Hedgehog Space said, freedom of religion has never been intended to be freedom from consequences. And I just go, something road to hell paved with what,
good intentions.
Good intentions, right? So that may not have been the intention behind freedom of religion, but unfortunately, freedom of religion, to the extent that it exists in the United States, is open to abuse, to the point where you've got people as recently as this week standing up in court in Utah on behalf of the church and basically saying, yeah, we do think that secular courts shouldn't be able to weigh in on anything we do. Essentially, that was their position was, we do think that we can argue that everything we do is protected by religious freedom, and therefore you don't get to weigh in on any of what we do. And the judge kind of rightly prompted back and say, you can't hide behind being a church to try and then commit fraud. You can't do that. So the fact, though, that they're arguing about that shows that the protections for religious freedom are allowing some pretty shady behavior. If you've got a judge having to make the point to someone, hang on, you don't just get to be fraudulent just because you're a church, as though that ever needed pointing out. Let's move on to what 21st century saints
Morgan Campbell's point. As an American, I predict any professionals they bring in will be a Jodie Hildebrand. That kind of links to what I'm saying. Is
it would have to be
it would have to be actual professionals, but I think it still happens in the UK. You get your tame in-house lawyers and people like that.
Yeah, but I don't think we have the snake oil salesman like Jodie Hildebrand to the same extent. I think we tend to regulate professional titles a bit better in the UK. But I do take that.
And also, I think that the church really should show some good faith in this and bring in organisations with real credibility, such as the Centre of Expertise for Sexual Abuse, the NSPCC, Bernardo's. They should bring in credible organisations that are really good stakeholders in the safeguarding world. not some random member who's a member of the church that will just say yes, 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 and do whatever the church tell him to say in training.
And this is actually a perfect segue, because I'm the expert at dragging these things into segues because I have to deal with this rowdy lot. This is perfect because 21st Century Saints could be one of those organizations, even with Sarah's expertise, that claims, oh yeah, the church, you can just bring us in to do training. They could do a Jodie Hildebrandt, but they're not going to. They're going to point to other organizations that the church should work with. So Sarah, tell us a little bit about those organizations you've been working with and what you were doing. How good a segue was that, people?
It's good. I think that there's a couple of key organisations that have really supported the work that we've done around safeguarding in the church. One of them is the NWG charity that focuses on sexual exploitation and abuse. That was set up on the back of some of the sexual abuse gangs and stunt grooming that was going on in this country. And the Home Office approached some key people in safeguarding and said, can you set something up that would actually address some of these issues? Really good charity that have got lots of information, lots of support. And actually, if people Google their website, go on to NWG charity, go on to resources, then there's presentations that we've done for that charity and resources and 21st Century Saints on there. So have a look at that, folks. It's some good stuff there. The other one is the Centre of Expertise for Child Sexual Abuse, which are a leading agency looking at research, training, education, professional development around the whole field of sexual abuse in this country. They're hosted by Bernardos, but funded by NSPCC, Home Office, National Crime Agency. They're an amalgamation of many, many, many people that have come together, top-notch academics across the country that have all come together to put together the kind of best research, the best training, the best development. So they're really good organisations that could come in and do an amazing job for the church, absolutely amazing. And then we've got the NSPCC, which is the biggest children's charity in this country, that offer training across the nation, they offer training nationwide to professionals working in this field. So we would actually encourage them, the church, to invite people like that to come in and deliver training. We'd extend that invitation to, can you get them to look at your child protection policies, help them advise on your child protection policies, help them look at what you've got, how can you improve it, how can you implement this so that it's more effective in practice? How can you more effectively train people? How can you develop the leadership skills for people to actually lead on safeguarding? Because the government in this country have been told that the bishop in a local congregation is the responsible person for safeguarding.
Who told them that, Sarah?
The church lawyer who runs the helpline told the Independent Inquiry that the bishop was the person responsible for safeguarding.
That was Andrew Ford.
Which is why it's a little bit concerning when the bishop can't answer a simple question as to what the safeguarding policies are. So there are things that they can do. Bring in external organisations, listen to victims.
Hang on 1 second, Sarah. 1 second, because I feel like you're going through your suggestions now, aren't you? You've jumped ahead. You've jumped ahead.
I'm just about
there we go.
to.
Right. So, just to explain where these recommendations are coming from. So first of things first, when we're saying things that Andrew Ford said to the inquiry, because I don't have a problem saying his name, he's not Voldemort. I've put the link to what he said to the inquiry in the description. That will be on once this live stream is finished. I'll update the description with all the sources. You'll be able to see stuff there about the NWG as well, the NSPCC. You'll be able to look at the government bill. So you'll be able to look into all this yourself in a lot more detail. The other thing is we are shamelessly plugging something that 21st Century Saints have put together, which is a booklet that is full of recommendations for what people can do, safeguarding vulnerable groups and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So at the end of that booklet are 9 recommendations of what the church can do to better safeguard children. I could put them on screen. I can do one better. There you go.
Excellent.
So, Sarah, if you could walk us through those recommendations, please. And we're all going to sit here and look really lovely. Peter, what are you eating, by the way? Chocolate, my man.
Very
Fruit
nice.
and nut. They're my version of Jaffa cakes.
Fruit and nuts, excellent. Okay, right. Sarah, take it away.
Before the church implemented DBS checks, when we were talking to them and asking the church to please bring in DBS checks, what we actually found was that what we were really pleased to hear about was the church set up a safeguarding committee. And they set up a safeguarding committee that was made up of lawyers and stake presidents, and they included a couple of people from family services. They didn't actually go what would have actually been gold standard to bring in external agencies to have helped and supported them, but they did actually bring together people in-house. to set up that safeguarding committee. No, they disbanded it as soon as they brought in DBS checks. But we would suggest to the church that they re-establish their safeguarding committee. And this time they bring in people from external agencies. They bring in victims, they bring in survivors of abuse, they bring in professionals, and they actually ask people to serve on that committee, not based on their Mormon CV, because they're kind of know all the Mormon stuff and they're Peter Priesthood or Molly Mormon, but based on their professional expertise and understanding and knowledge of abuse. And that they bring together that committee to help the church further develop what they want to have as a gold standard in safeguarding. So we would suggest that they actually set up that committee, victims, external agencies and experts. They need to extend the DBS process. At the moment, they're doing DBS checks for people working with children. They need to extend it to people working with vulnerable adults. The amount of adults in our church that are an ageing population that have got dementia, that have got significant vulnerabilities because of age, is growing, and it's going to continue to grow as all the young people seem to be vanishing a bit. It's going to continue to grow. And what we need to see is those people protected by anybody that would try and take advantage of them through a process of enhanced DBS checks and adequate training on how to work with vulnerable adults, on how to support vulnerable adults, those with disabilities, mental health.
Before you jump to the next one, sorry, I just want to jump in because I remember saying something about this a while back, because you said that we recommend developing a system of feedback and analysis informed by the state safeguarding specialists to learn from their experience, to identify further training needs and share best practice. Yes. We had a discussion a while back about stake safeguarding specialists, which is a calling, for those who don't know, that exists within the UK church specifically in response to the implementation of background checks and the advocacy work that was done by the members of this panel. The problem with that calling, they've got someone like Sarah in the calling in one stake, and Sarah is the bane of that stake because she knows what she's on about. We are not used to people in callings actually knowing what they're on about, because the whole USP of the church is that people are just called and put into positions. You know, the only exception we make is the ward organist, and even then that's tenuous at best because sometimes they can't play the thing. So generally, outside of music, we don't tend to call qualified people to positions that they may need qualifications for. When was the last time someone was called as the ward clerk because they are a financial expert in their life? Ruth, have you ever been called as ward clerk?
Funnily, no.
No, interesting. So, you know,
or not an auditor for the church then, Ruth?
No.
But the problem with this sort of calling then, right, is that actually you would need someone who develops knowledge and specialism over time, or even brings it in, or receives training so that they have that knowledge and specialist skills. But either the church would have to get that training in every time a new person's called, or someone would have to stay in calling for a long time, and that's far too much power to give to someone, particularly a woman. The only people that get to stay in callings for multiple years are bishops and stake presidents, because that's how they gather and consolidate power to, you know, keep their position of authority over the ward, being cynical. But yeah, that's, you know, that's the issue I see with a calling like this, and with this recommendation here. Sorry, what would you say to that?
Can I just ask? Sorry, just you mentioned, Peter, especially as a woman, all these. I don't know about many, but all the ones I'm aware of are female. Is this becoming a lady calling? Do you have a sense, Sarah, of the gender balance of people being called to this role as a stake specialist?
I think it's probably fairly evenly split. I mean, I don't really know exactly who is, but from what I've seen, I think it's fairly evenly split, men, women. There has been a lot of professional advice that safeguarding leads in any institution should be women, particularly in patriarchal organisations, because it helps adjust the balance a little bit. But then you need women that are able to actually say no and not be a mouthpiece for the organisation. And that's the key bit. They've got to have somebody in this calling who is prepared to challenge and say to people, no, that is not okay. You cannot do that.
And we're all leaving.
This is true. Yeah, or being pushed out. Because
they stood up and said no.
Or being pushed out. Absolutely. But that's, I mean, one of the things that I say to everyone, and I've been around my state doing all the training I've done, is nobody in this church can tell you not to report abuse. You do not have to tell the abuse helpline. You do not have to tell the bishop. You do not have to tell the state president. You can simply report this to children's services and the police. And then if you want to, you can tell them afterwards, but you don't have to do that. Now, that's actually a complete controversial message to the one the church gives. So far, I'm still able to say it, but
Hedgehog in Space has stopped being an apologist for the United States Constitution, has come over to a rational way of thinking now. I'm so sorry. They said, I do think that callings are more aimed at keeping people off balance and compliant rather than competent. I wonder how much incompetence is kind of baked into the model of the LDS Church, and how actually this is therefore a challenge to the way the church likes to run things, keeping people feeling like they're treading water, keeping people feeling like they're really struggling so that they're reliant on the organization. Actually then getting organizations to come in and train them. You know, I'm sorry, I'm just jumping through this list for you now, Sarah, but it says safeguarding training should meet NSPCC minimum standards. Training should also draw on the experience of victims and opportunities to identify biases and assumptions. Training should be regular and comprehensive. The church would have to bring in outside agencies to provide that training, and that would then have the people in the callings not feeling like they're treading water anymore, and feeling actually, you know, competent and able to do the job. And I do wonder whether that's actually against something that the church has intentionally baked into the volunteer calling system.
I think it's, I mean, I think about myself in the calling and the things that I say, the things that I do. And I actually know that some leaders would have a real problem with it. They would feel really uncomfortable with it. Because I'm not towing the party line. I'm saying, actually, this is what's best for safeguarding. This is what we need to do. This is how we need to do it.
Well, we know what happens when you don't toe the party line, don't we, Peter? Yes. We've learned by sad experience.
This is why it is such a radical culture shift. It's going to be really hard to, you know, because it's so ingrained that we are our own autonomous entity and we don't, you know, take any interference from the outside.
Well, I'm adorable. I'm adorable and loved, so I'm allowed to do it.
But no, to Peter's point, and then we'll bring Ruth in. To Peter's point, this would essentially create a conflict point at some conceivable moment where someone is forced to choose between what they've been told to do by a government agency that knows how to protect children and what a bishop who doesn't know what they're on about or who hasn't listened to the training or thinks they know better is saying with the voice of God.
Yes.
And the church doesn't want that conflict within its congregations. That's why they want these agencies out. I think you can boil it down to that. They don't want people having to choose between anyone else and them, because they want them to automatically choose them. Ruth.
So I think it's emotive when we're thinking about child abuse, rightly so. It's very emotive. We all get emotional about those sorts of things. But with any sort of other safety issue, when we're thinking about fire safety, building regulations, we wouldn't bat an eye about a professional coming in to assess the building and say you've used the right tiles on the wall there, you've got the right number of fire extinguishers for the size of the room. All of those things we have to comply with, and we just suck it up and can get on with it. And if we try to make excuses or prevaricate on that, we'd just be shut down while we sorted our lives out and got back on track. And I think when it comes to safeguarding, it should be that same sort of mindset of, this is the country that we operate in. These are the safety rules when it comes to safeguarding of children and vulnerable adults and basically the community. This is what we need to get on track with, and we need to allow the professionals to tell us today what is best measures to be taken.
There's 2 points there. I mean, the first, we know about the people that got carbon monoxide poisoning because the church didn't install the alarm because they didn't need to, because the code didn't say they needed to. So why would they? You know, it's almost like the same who is compelled in all things is a slothful servant. But you know, what do I know? And then the second point I would make, while I'm feeling snarky towards the church, is, have you seen the chapels that members built in the 50s and 60s? You know, I went to St. Albans, and the subsidence on that building, there's a massive crack in the wall. They've got monitors in measuring the size of the. So, you know, you say that we wouldn't bat an eyelid at health and safety coming in.
I think that's
I agree.
We don't mess with fire regulations. We don't mess with those, do we?
But some of our buildings are shonky, to say the least.
Sadly, they'll no longer be needed before they actually fall down.
I was just going to make that point. Don't worry.
All right, can we just think of this a minute?
I've been getting us through with like 4 from the end. Go on.
Excellent. I think this one's a really interesting one. We've asked the church to look at every report of abuse and that it should be reviewed for learning and improvement. Yeah. So stop just ignoring abuse. If you get an allegation, you have a case of abuse, it should be reviewed with expert advice and guidance to actually see what can be learned from it. And the church should publish data and publish data about abuse. Let's be really clear. They said 16 cases in 10 years. Tell us how you defined an allegation. Tell us what your definition of an allegation was so that we actually know what you're counting as a case of abuse and allegation. So I think we want the church to be much more transparent in what they're recording, what they're reporting, what they're counting, and how they're looking at that information. And we actually think that it's a bit of a Wild West out there in religious communities. Some of them think they can do anything they want. Others try really hard to toe the line, and you get everything in between. And I think what we're saying is at some point there needs to be some government oversight of what's happening in safeguarding of churches and faith communities.
I can feel the Americans in the chat shuddering at the 2 words government oversight.
Fine. That is absolutely fine. They can shudder away. But the reality is, unless there is some government oversight, we know that all the recommendations, the guidance, the good practice has all been ignored by churches and faith communities, ours more than any other. They've been ignored. So actually what we're left with is wanting the government to say, we're going to have some kind of regulatory framework. We're going to have some kind of obligations on the part of churches in order for them to continue to carry out the activities that they want to deliver for children and young people. We need to have some confirmation that they're doing that in a safe and appropriate way, which is one reason why we actually think people need to be talking to their members of parliament in the UK.
Well, before we get to people talking to their members of parliament, I'm going to make myself big and important on the screen for a moment and remind everyone that this is the time when you can hit the like button if you've liked this video. You can hit the subscribe button if you want to see more of these videos. And if you want to help me continue to make these videos as my full-time job in this lovely studio that you see here, you can become a channel member and send... it's very cheap, and you get a Jammy Dodger little emoji, and you can send that in the chat, and it's all great. Or you can send monthly donations at the donor box link in the description. And monthly donations are how I keep this channel going. So all support is welcome. I'm really grateful that people have been here in the comments and in the live chat as well. So yes, there we are. Back to the discussion of the important things. We want everyone to do a little bit of activism, don't we?
We do.
We do. Okay, Sarah, what do you think if I were to suggest that maybe people in the UK contact their local member of parliament and ask their local member of parliament what they think about this bill?
I think excellent.
And maybe ask their local member of parliament to reach out to the local bishop and ask the local bishop what the church's safeguarding policies are, so that they can sort of better understand the church's position in all this and how the church may be affected by this legislation, so that they could support the church in becoming compliant if they support this legislation. What do you think to that?
I think that's a really important step for people to take. I think, first of all, it sends a clear message to the church that actually this is being taken really seriously by members of parliament that want to discharge their duty and responsibilities in debating a bill with accurate information at their fingertips. It's a responsible act to take for children living within the constituency of any member of parliament, for that member of parliament to know what are the safeguarding policies and procedures that that child is being cared for under. And it actually brings attention to the fact that we need to know how MPs are going to vote for this in parliament. The members of parliament are going to have to make a decision around how they vote for this. And the more people that talk to their MP and say, this is what I think about it, the more MPs are going to start listening to how people want them to vote. And that's really important.
Peter, what do you think about contacting the MPs?
I think it's really good. What this booklet does is it, first of all, it's kind of a non-Mormon's guide to what's going on with our church and safeguarding. So although it finishes with those recommendations for making further improvements, it gives it's like a cultural awareness sort of guide. So it's really useful for them anyway, just to explain what the norms are within the LDS church, who's who, some explanation of which people have what callings and what the names mean, so they know who they're dealing with. It celebrates the list of really good improvements that have already happened, so it's not all about, oh, it's still not good enough sort of thing. And then it finishes with recommendations for what also needs to be added to our current policies to start to match professional standards and the standards in the other mainstream Christian denominations that are much more responsible. So it's kind of a really helpful guide, almost that you don't have to do too much talking if you don't want to, just send them the document, and it might be helpful for them if they're having a conversation with local church members, because we've made sure it's all very clear and understandable for someone who's a non-Mormon specialist. I think also it's something that would be good to share with local church leaders, because again, with sort of, get their opinion on it. Do you think it all agrees? Or is this fair statement of what's going on? But also to introduce them to the idea that there's still a gap between what the church is doing and what a professional standard actually looks like. I think this is going to be one of our biggest challenges, that there's always an instinct towards complacency in the church. Before having DBS checks, it's all good enough, we've got it all covered. And every so often we have some training. As bishops, we talked about that once in a meeting. We all know what we're doing, which is, if you're in a professional setting, what proper training looks like. It's completely inadequate. So I think it'd be good to share with them as well. I think we need to get out a PDF version that can be shared electronically easily. Some people have been requesting that.
We've been sending it around.
Yeah, great. So is it something that we can post in the notes for this show? What's the megabyteage on it? Is it something that's small enough to send as an email?
Well, we just need a link that people can click on. So I'll work that out with 21st Century Saints. Come back and check the show notes in a few minutes after the live stream.
We've sent it out successfully in email to anyone who's asked. So
Right. Well, what's the email address for 21st Century Saints? Plug it. What is it?
Jane will be typing.
Jane's in the chat. So
it's either me, Sarah, DE. Hang on, let me put it.
We don't want you giving out your personal email address.
No,
Sarah. The abuse you will get will be rampant.
Well, we've put those on the booklet, so
right.
Yeah.
And I only use this for church. I only use this email address for church anyway. I don't use it for anything else.
Right, here you go. 21st Century Saints has come in. To get your PDF versions of the booklet, in the meantime, you can message us via our social media channels. Yeah, there you go. Perfect. Someone said, if you contact your MP, can you remain anonymous?
Yes.
You can. There you go.
You can.
Your MP has to be assured that you're a member of the person within their constituency, right?
Not to your MP, you can't.
Yes.
You have to tell your MP your name and address so they can verify you're a constituent, but they will not tell the church who you are.
Yeah, so they will keep you anonymous from the church.
Yeah.
But yeah, there you go.
I think contacting your MP has a lot of positives. I think with anything, you are focusing that MPs are just human beings. They are just regular people that are doing this, and often they're very led by what's in the news or what maybe they've heard from a handful of people in their constituency. It's amazing what a difference just a handful of people can make to an MP's focus. Maybe that's the difference between them turning up and voting on something or skipping that day and doing something else instead. There's always priorities. So it is amazing what I think just a regular person can do by just telling the MP, hey, this is something that I'm interested in. Please keep me abreast of developments. I would be really, really keen to understand this further. And from our perspective as members of a congregation or former members of a congregation, this is our observations and what we think would work well and what we've seen as failures in the past that we think need to be addressed, I think they would really appreciate that conversation. So yeah, I think contacting the MP makes a massive difference, certainly on a local level.
Definitely. And I think
also read the booklet yourself, so that you become yourself kind of familiar with what the issues are and how to frame them if you're having one-to-one conversations with people in the community or with LDS leaders. You know, it's a bit like when we went on missions and taught the discussions. It's like, oh, okay, this makes sense now. You know, you kind of actually hear, you're meant to have absorbed this by osmosis, but actually seeing things laid out in an organized way can be really helpful. Not always strictly accurate, but we can definitely vouch for the accuracy of this booklet. So I think as a way of now, the booklets are a bit expensive to publish as physical entities. Is there a way that if people want to make donations to 21st Century Saints, they can help with the publishing and postage costs?
Yeah, if anybody looks on our look on our Facebook page. Jane might be able to pop it in the med chat, but look on our Facebook page, and any help towards the publication costs of getting the booklet printed and posted would be very, very appreciated.
All right. Well, on that note, everyone, have a great night. Make sure you do the following. If you're a Brit, contact your MP and get them to ask the local leader for a copy of the church's safeguarding policies, and get them to start a discussion with the local church and just see how they might be able to help. So with that, take care, everyone. I'll see you next time we do a live stream, but thank you very much, everyone, for who's participated. And see you next time. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. Bye.